Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing that many of the thoughts you believed were completely your own were carefully planted, not by science fiction machines, not by mind-reading aliens, but by systems that have existed for centuries. Governments, advertisers, ideologies, algorithms, and psychological techniques refined across history. The terrifying truth is this: your brain doesn't need to be hacked, it only needs to be guided. Throughout human history, powerful groups have quietly studied one question more than any other. How do you influence what millions of people think without them ever realizing it? The answers they discovered shaped wars, elections, revolutions, religions, and entire civilizations. But the most unsettling part, many of those techniques are still being used today, more sophisticated than ever before, hidden in plain sight. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain, because once you see these hidden systems of influence, you'll never look at your thoughts the same way again. And you may start wondering how many of your beliefs were truly yours to begin with. Before we go deeper into this psychological journey through history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy thought-provoking documentaries like this. And I'm curious about something. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Are you watching late at night, questioning reality, or during a quiet moment in your day? Let me know. Now, let's begin. Long before psychology textbooks, long before television screens and internet algorithms, human beings were already discovering something extraordinary about the mind. Control didn't require force, it required belief. Thousands of years ago, in the earliest civilizations, leaders began to realize that the most powerful weapon they possessed was not their armies, but the stories people believed about the world. Because once a person believes something deeply enough, they will defend it, live by it, and even die for it, without ever questioning who wrote the story in the first place. And the first masters of this invisible influence appeared in the ancient world. Imagine standing in a massive temple city thousands of years ago. Towering stone structures rise above the desert sky. Incense fills the air. Priests dressed in ceremonial robes walk through echoing halls lit by flickering torches. Outside, thousands of citizens wait in silence. They are not waiting for entertainment. They are waiting for guidance. In many ancient civilizations, religious authorities were not simply spiritual leaders. They were the interpreters of reality itself. They explained why the sun rose, why floods came, why wars were won, why kings ruled. But something deeper was happening beneath these rituals, because whoever controlled the explanation of the world controlled how people behaved inside it. If a drought struck, it was not seen as a natural event. It was interpreted as the anger of the gods. If the crops failed, people believed someone had disobeyed divine laws. And if a king claimed the gods had chosen him to rule, then rebellion was not merely political, it became sacrilege. This was one of the earliest psychological systems of influence ever created, not through lies necessarily, but through narratives powerful enough to shape reality in people's minds. One of the clearest examples can be seen in ancient Egypt. For thousands of years, Egyptian pharaohs ruled over one of the most stable civilizations in human history. But their power was not based purely on military strength. It rested on a carefully constructed belief. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler. He was believed to be a living god. This idea was repeated everywhere, on temple walls, in public ceremonies, and stories told to children. Images carved into massive monuments showed the pharaoh towering over ordinary people, often depicted beside gods themselves. To question the pharaoh's authority wasn't just political dissent. It meant questioning the cosmic order of the universe. And when millions of people accept that narrative as truth, control becomes almost effortless. But Egypt was far from the only civilization to understand this psychological principle. Across ancient Mesopotamia, rulers inscribed laws into giant stone tablets, presenting them as commands delivered directly from divine forces. In ancient China, emperors claimed something known as the mandate of heaven, a belief that their authority came from cosmic approval. And in many early cultures, myths were carefully woven to explain why society must remain exactly as it was. Because myths do more than entertain. They create mental frameworks. They shape what people consider normal, possible, or forbidden. And once those frameworks exist, they guide behavior without needing constant enforcement. But influence in the ancient world was not only built through religion, it was also built through ritual. Rituals are powerful psychological tools.
They create shared emotional experiences, reinforce group identity, and strengthen beliefs through repetition. Think about what happens during a grand ceremony. Music plays, crowds gather, symbols appear everywhere. Participants repeat words and gestures together. Slowly, something remarkable happens inside the human brain. Individual thinking fades, and collective identity takes its place. The person stops thinking as I, they begin thinking as we. Ancient leaders understood this instinctively. That's why ceremonies celebrating kings, gods, victories, and traditions were so elaborate and frequent. They weren't just celebrations, they were reinforcement mechanisms. Each ritual reminded people who held power, who deserved loyalty, and what the world supposedly meant. And over time, repetition transforms ideas into unquestioned truths. But perhaps the most powerful tool of influence in ancient societies was something even simpler: storytelling. Human beings are wired for stories. A well-told narrative can bypass logic and go straight to emotion. It makes complex ideas memorable, it turns rules into legends, and it allows beliefs to travel across generations without ever being written down. Ancient storytellers, priests, elders, poets, became the carriers of these narratives. Around fires, inside temples, or in bustling marketplaces, they told tales explaining the origins of the world and humanity's place within it. Some stories warned of chaos if traditions were broken, others praised obedience and loyalty, but all of them shaped the invisible map inside people's minds, the map that determined how they interpreted reality. And the most effective stories shared a common feature: they made the system feel inevitable, not constructed, not designed, but natural, as if the hierarchy of kings, priests, warriors, and farmers had always existed, and always would. Once a belief feels natural, people rarely question it. Yet influence did not always come from rulers. Sometimes it emerged from philosophers. In ancient Greece, thinkers began studying the mechanics of persuasion itself. They observed how speeches could sway crowds, how emotions could override logic, and how carefully chosen words could move entire assemblies. These early philosophers were among the first to recognize that the human mind is not perfectly rational. It is guided by emotion, identity, fear, pride, and belonging. Understanding those forces meant understanding how influence works. One philosopher in particular explored this idea deeply. He studied rhetoric, the art of persuasion. He analyzed how arguments could be structured to appeal not just to reason, but to character and emotion. His work would shape communication for thousands of years, because once persuasion becomes a science, influence becomes far more precise. But something else was happening during this time. Influence was slowly becoming portable. Instead of existing only in temples or royal courts, ideas were beginning to travel. Philosophy spread across regions, religions expanded beyond their original cultures, empires carried belief systems wherever their armies marched, and each new civilization added its own techniques for shaping human thought. Over centuries, these methods became more refined, more intentional, more strategic, but the most important realization remained the same as it had been in ancient temples thousands of years ago. If you want to guide a civilization, you don't need to control every person. You only need to shape the ideas they carry inside their minds, because once those ideas take root, people begin enforcing them on each other. Parents teach them to children, communities defend them, societies build laws around them, and eventually the original architects of those beliefs disappear into history, but the influence remains, quiet, invisible, working through generations who believe the ideas were always theirs. And yet, the ancient world was only the beginning. Because as societies grew larger and communication expanded, the techniques of influence evolved into something far more sophisticated, more organized, more scientific, and far more powerful. By the early 20th century, a new question began emerging among governments and strategists around the world, a question that would reshape the modern era. What if persuasion could be scaled to influence millions of minds at once? The answer would appear during one of the most turbulent periods in human history, a time when the battle for territory was matched by something far more subtle: the battle for belief itself. And that battle would give birth to a word that still shapes the world today: propaganda. And once it was unleashed, the hidden control of the human mind would enter an entirely new chapter.
By the early 20th century, the world had changed in a way no ancient empire could have imagined. For the first time in human history, messages could travel across entire nations almost instantly. Newspapers circulated by the millions, posters appeared on every street, radio signals carried voices across vast distances, and suddenly, something extraordinary became possible. Influence was no longer limited to temples, royal courts, or public speeches. It could now reach entire populations at once. But no one yet fully understood how powerful this new system could become. That realization would arrive during one of the darkest chapters in modern history. In 1914, Europe erupted into a conflict that would eventually become known as the First World War. At first, many believed the war would end quickly,
But as the fighting dragged on, governments faced a terrifying problem. Modern warfare required millions of soldiers, factories needed to produce endless supplies, and the public had to continue supporting a war that was becoming increasingly brutal and exhausting. The challenge was no longer just defeating the enemy on the battlefield, it was controlling morale at home, because if citizens lost faith in the war effort, entire governments could collapse. This realization led to something unprecedented. For the first time, governments began building organized systems dedicated entirely to shaping public opinion. They called it propaganda. At first, propaganda was subtle. Newspapers printed patriotic stories about heroism at the front lines. Posters encouraged young men to enlist. Songs and speeches celebrated national pride. But soon the messaging became far more strategic because psychologists and communication experts began studying something important. People rarely make decisions based purely on facts. They respond to emotion, fear, pride, anger, hope. The most powerful propaganda did not simply provide information, it created emotional realities. And once emotions were involved, persuasion became dramatically more effective. One of the most famous examples appeared in recruitment campaigns. A single image began appearing across posters and newspapers, an authoritative figure pointing directly at the viewer, his eyes staring straight into yours. The message was simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Your country needs you. It worked because it turned a national message into a personal call to action. Instead of speaking to the crowd, it spoke to the individual. The viewer felt personally responsible, personally addressed, and this simple psychological trick helped recruit millions of soldiers. But propaganda was not only used to inspire loyalty, it was also used to shape perception of the enemy. Across many nations involved in the war, propaganda campaigns began portraying opposing countries in frightening ways. Enemy soldiers were depicted as monsters, savages, threats to civilization itself. These images and stories created something powerful inside the public imagination: fear. Once fear takes hold, people become far more willing to support extreme actions because they believe they are protecting themselves from something dangerous. This emotional framing helped maintain support for a war that was costing millions of lives. But perhaps the most important discovery of this era was not just that propaganda worked, it was how well it worked. Governments realized that carefully crafted messages could influence entire societies. Public opinion was not fixed, it could be guided, directed, engineered, and once leaders understood that, they never forgot it. After the war ended, many thinkers began reflecting on what had just happened. They realized something unsettling. Millions of people had supported massive national efforts not simply because of facts or events, but because of how those events had been presented to them. Among the individuals studying this phenomenon was a man who would later become known as one of the architects of modern persuasion. His name was Edward Bernays. Bernays had worked with U.S. wartime propaganda efforts and had witnessed firsthand how public opinion could be shaped on a massive scale. After the war, he asked a bold question. If propaganda could mobilize entire nations during wartime, why couldn't similar techniques be used during peacetime? This idea would change the modern world forever, because Bernays began applying the psychology of propaganda not to war, but to advertising, politics, and public relations. He believed that modern society was too complex for people to fully understand every issue they faced, so instead, skilled communicators could guide public thinking in helpful directions. In his view, influence was not just inevitable, it was necessary. But the methods he developed revealed something deeper about the human mind. People rarely act based purely on logic. They respond to symbols, to identity, to emotion, to social pressure. By shaping these psychological forces, messages could guide behavior without people realizing they were being influenced. Bernays called this process the engineering of consent. And once businesses and political leaders understood the potential of this idea, its use expanded rapidly. But propaganda was not limited to democratic societies. In fact, some of its most intense forms appeared under authoritarian regimes. Leaders who understood the power of mass communication began building entire state systems designed to control information. Newspapers repeated official narratives. Films glorified national ideology. Schools taught carefully constructed versions of history. The goal was not just persuasion, it was total narrative control. If citizens only heard one version of reality repeated constantly, alternative perspectives slowly disappeared. Over time, the official narrative became the only one many people knew. And once that happens, influence becomes almost invisible because people are not aware that different interpretations even exist. But propaganda does not always rely on deception. Sometimes it simply highlights certain truths while ignoring others. This technique is powerful because it feels honest. After all, the information being presented might be accurate. But by selecting which facts to emphasize and which to hide, communicators can dramatically change how events are understood. This strategy still shapes modern media today because information is rarely neutral. The way it is framed, What is emphasized, what is omitted, what emotions are attached, can change how millions of people interpret the same event. And that realization transformed propaganda into something much larger than wartime messaging. It became a science of influence, a system built on psychology, communication theory, and an ever-growing understanding of human behavior. But even as propaganda expanded across governments and industries, researchers began asking deeper questions. What if influence could go beyond persuasion? What if human behavior itself could be experimented on? What if scientists could discover the hidden triggers that control how people think, obey, and react? Inside universities and secret research programs, psychologists began exploring these questions. And some of the experiments they conducted would become among the most controversial studies in scientific history, because they revealed something deeply unsettling. The human mind is far more suggestible than most people believe. Under the right conditions, ordinary individuals can be guided to think, believe, and act in ways they never imagined possible. And the discoveries made during those experiments would open a new chapter in the story of influence. A chapter where persuasion would no longer rely only on messages, but on understanding the hidden mechanics of the brain itself.
By the middle of the 20th century, the science of influence had begun to move away from speeches, posters, and propaganda. A new question was emerging in laboratories and research institutions across the world. If persuasion could shape opinions, could science uncover the deeper mechanisms that control human behavior itself? Psychologists began turning their attention inward, toward the mysterious workings of the human mind. What they discovered would shake the foundations of how we understand free will, because under certain conditions, the human brain can be guided in ways that feel almost unbelievable. And some of the most famous experiments in history revealed just how fragile independent thinking might be. In the 1950s, a psychologist became fascinated by a simple but unsettling idea. Why do people follow authority, even when doing so feels wrong? History had already shown many disturbing examples. Wars, oppressive regimes, and tragic events had often involved ordinary individuals carrying out orders they might never have considered on their own. But the question remained, were those individuals uniquely cruel, or was obedience something deeply embedded in human psychology? To explore this mystery, a series of experiments was designed that would later become some of the most discussed in the history of behavioral science. Participants were invited to take part in what they believed was a study about learning and memory. They arrived at a laboratory, met the researchers, and were introduced to another participant, who they believed was just another volunteer. But there was something the volunteers did not know. The other participant was actually part of the experiment, and the real subject of the study was them. The volunteers were told they would test how punishment affected learning. They were instructed to administer small electric shocks to the other participant whenever he answered a question incorrectly. At first, the shocks were mild, but with each mistake, the voltage increased. Soon the person receiving the shocks began to protest. He complained about pain, he asked for the experiment to stop. Eventually, he begged to be released. But the researchers calmly instructed the volunteers to continue. And something remarkable and disturbing happened. Many participants hesitated. They expressed discomfort, some even questioned whether the experiment should proceed.
Finally ended, something unexpected happened. The powerful psychological techniques that had been used to mobilize nations during wartime did not disappear. They simply changed uniforms. The battle for territory was fading, but a new battlefield was emerging, one that existed inside everyday life, the battlefield of desire. Factories that once produced weapons now produced refrigerators, radios, cars, clothing, and thousands of new consumer goods. But there was a problem. Factories could produce more products than people actually needed. And if economies were going to keep growing, something had to change. People didn't just need to buy what they needed. They had to begin buying what they wanted, even when they didn't need it. This meant businesses faced a completely new challenge. They didn't just have to sell products. They had to shape desire itself. And to accomplish that, they turned to the same psychological insights that had once fueled propaganda. At the center of this transformation were experts who had studied human behavior during the earlier decades of psychological experimentation. They understood something fundamental about the human mind. People rarely buy things because of logic. They buy things because of emotion. A car is not simply transportation. It becomes a symbol of freedom. A watch is not simply a timekeeping device. It becomes a signal of status. A bottle of perfume is not just a scent. It becomes a promise of attraction, confidence, identity. The product itself was almost secondary. What mattered was the story attached to it.
and advertisers began mastering the art of attaching powerful emotional meanings to ordinary objects. Walk through a city in the mid-20th century and you would begin to notice something new. Billboards towering above streets, colorful magazine spreads, radio commercials playing between songs. Everywhere people turned, messages were appearing. But these messages were not random. They were carefully designed psychological triggers. One advertisement might show a family laughing around a dinner table, suggesting that a certain brand of food could bring warmth and happiness into your home. Another might show a confident businessman stepping out of a sleek car, implying that success and admiration came packaged with the vehicle. The pattern repeated everywhere. Products were no longer marketed as tools. They were marketed as identities. And the most effective advertisements did something very clever. They created a problem you didn't know you had, and then offered the product as the solution. Perhaps you weren't as confident as you could be. Maybe your home wasn't as modern as your neighbors. Maybe you weren't expressing your individuality strongly enough. These subtle suggestions planted tiny seeds of dissatisfaction, and once dissatisfaction existed, the product could step in as the answer. But the real brilliance of advertising lay in something deeper. It worked best when people didn't feel they were being persuaded at all. Psychologists working with advertising agencies began studying how the subconscious mind responded to images, colors, music, and repetition. They discovered that the brain absorbs far more information than we consciously notice. A logo seen repeatedly begins to feel familiar. A familiar brand begins to feel trustworthy, even when a person cannot remember exactly where they saw the brand before. This phenomenon became known as the mere exposure effect. The more often people encounter something, the more comfortable they feel with it. Advertising used this principle relentlessly. Brands appeared again and again across newspapers, radio broadcasts, billboards, and television. Over time, these repeated exposures created an illusion. The brand began to feel like a natural part of the world, like it had always been there. And when consumers finally stood in a store deciding what to buy, the familiar name quietly pulled their attention, not through force, but through recognition. As television entered homes in the 1950s and 60s, advertising evolved even further. Now influence could combine visual storytelling, music, emotion, and repetition all at once. Commercials became miniature films. They showed idealized lifestyles, happy families, adventurous travelers, glamorous social scenes. Products appeared within these stories almost like magical objects capable of unlocking that life. Viewers didn't just see advertisements, they saw aspirations. And because television entered homes daily, those aspirations were repeated again and again, gradually shaping what people believed success, happiness, and normal life should look like. Over time, a powerful cultural feedback loop formed. Advertising influenced culture, culture influenced desire, desire drove consumption, and consumption fueled the entire economic system. But there was another psychological technique quietly shaping this world of advertising, one that many people never noticed. It's called social proof. Human beings instinctively look to others when deciding how to behave. If many people approve of something, it feels safer to follow. Advertising used this instinct constantly. Commercials showed crowds enjoying the product. Testimonials praised its benefits. Celebrity endorsements suggested that admired figures used it too. The message was subtle but powerful. People like you choose this. Successful people choose this. Millions of people choose this. And once that perception takes hold, resistance becomes harder, because nobody wants to feel like the outsider who made the wrong choice. But perhaps the most profound shift created by advertising was not simply economic, it was psychological. For most of human history, identity was shaped largely by family, community, and tradition. But in the modern consumer age, identity began to intertwine with products. The clothes you wore, the car you drove, the phone you carried, the brands you preferred. Each of these choices quietly signaled something about who you were or who you wanted to become. Advertising didn't just sell objects, it sold versions of the self. And that meant influence had reached a new level. Instead of shaping individual decisions, it began shaping how people saw themselves. But even this powerful system was only one part of a larger transformation, because while advertising was influencing what people bought, another force was beginning to influence what people believed. Inside living rooms across the world, a glowing screen had become the center of attention. Families gathered around it every evening. News anchors delivered stories with calm authority. Shows entertained millions at the same time. For the first time in history, entire populations were experiencing the same images, the same narratives, the same information simultaneously. And this new medium would prove capable of something extraordinary, not just shaping desire, but shaping collective perception itself. Television had arrived, and with it, the power of mass media influence was about to reshape the human mind in ways few people yet understood.
By the time television began glowing in living rooms across the world, something profound had quietly changed in human history. For thousands of years, information had traveled slowly. News moved from town to town by word of mouth, letters, or printed pages. Different communities often lived inside completely different realities, shaped by local traditions and stories. But television collapsed that distance. Suddenly, millions of people could watch the same message at the same moment. And with that simple technological shift came an entirely new kind of influence, one that could shape not just individual desires, but the collective perception of reality itself. Because when the same images are repeated across an entire nation, those images begin to define what people believe the world actually looks like. In the early decades of television, the medium felt almost magical. Families would gather together in the evening, turning on a single screen that delivered entertainment, news, and stories from across the globe. There was a sense of trust surrounding those broadcasts. News anchors spoke with calm authority, their voices steady, their tone confident. For many viewers, the information coming through the television felt almost like a direct window into reality. But behind that window was something far more complex. Every broadcast required choices. Editors decided which stories to cover, producers determined how long each segment would last, directors selected which images would appear on screen. These decisions were rarely malicious, they were simply necessary for creating a coherent broadcast. Yet those choices had powerful consequence. Because what viewers saw was not reality itself, it was a filtered version of reality, and the way that reality was framed could dramatically shape how people understood the world around them. Psychologists studying media influence began noticing something fascinating. The human brain is deeply affected by repetition. If a certain type of story appears frequently in news broadcasts, viewers begin to believe that event is far more common than it actually is. For example, if violent crime stories dominate headlines night after night, people may begin to feel that the world is becoming increasingly dangerous, even if crime statistics remain stable. This phenomenon became known as the availability heuristic. The brain estimates the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. And television made certain examples incredibly easy to recall. Images of disasters, conflicts, political scandals, emotional tragedies. These stories naturally captured attention, which meant they were more likely to appear on television. But over time, the constant exposure could create a distorted sense of reality. Viewers weren't intentionally being misled, yet their perception of the world slowly shifted based on the stories they saw most often. Entertainment programming also carried subtle influence. Television shows began presenting idealized versions of life, perfectly organized homes, stylish clothing, effortlessly confident characters. These fictional worlds created powerful cultural templates. Viewers didn't necessarily believe those shows reflected real life exactly, but the repeated exposure began shaping expectations about what life should look like, what success meant, what relationships should feel like, what lifestyles represented achievement. Over time, television characters became more than entertainment. They became models of identity. Young viewers especially absorbed these images, using them to imagine their own futures. And as the television industry expanded, these narratives reached further and further into everyday life. But the real power of mass media influence appeared when television intersected with politics. For the first time, political leaders could communicate directly with millions of citizens through a single broadcast. Campaign speeches, televised debates, national addresses, all of these events allowed leaders to shape their public image in ways never before possible. A confident appearance on television could inspire trust. A moment of hesitation might raise doubt. Suddenly, political success depended not only on policies or speeches, but also on how leaders looked and sounded on screen. Charisma became visible. Emotion became contagious. A leader speaking passionately to a camera could reach into millions of living rooms simultaneously, and viewers often felt as if that leader was speaking directly to them. This new dynamic transformed politics into something closer to storytelling. Campaigns began focusing heavily on imagery, narrative framing, and emotional resonance. The political arena had become deeply intertwined with the psychology of media. Meanwhile, researchers studying audience behavior discovered another powerful phenomenon. When people see a story repeated across multiple sources, it begins to feel increasingly credible. This effect, sometimes called the illusory truth effect, occurs because familiarity creates a sense of truthfulness, even if the information itself is uncertain. The more often a statement is heard, the more comfortable it feels, and comfort can easily be mistaken for accuracy. Networks, newspapers, and radio broadcasts often repeated the same narratives throughout the day. Morning reports echoed evening headlines. Discussions repeated the same key phrases. Over time, those repeated ideas settled quietly into the public consciousness, not through force, but through familiarity. Yet the influence of mass media was not always intentional. Often it emerged from the simple mechanics of storytelling. Stories that evoke strong emotions naturally attract attention. They keep viewers engaged. They increase ratings. And so producers naturally gravitated towards narratives that triggered curiosity, fear, hope, or outrage. This pattern created a subtle feedback loop. The stories that attracted the most attention became the stories that were shown most often, and the stories shown most often shaped the audience's perception of reality. In this way, media influence was not always directed by a single controlling force. Sometimes it was the result of countless small decisions made by journalists, editors, and producers, all responding to the same incentive: keep the audience watching. But by the late 20th century, something even more transformative was beginning to emerge, a technology that would eventually surpass television in its ability to shape information. Unlike television, which delivered the same broadcast to everyone, this new system could deliver different information to each individual.
It could track behavior, analyze preferences, predict curiosity, and tailor content to hold attention as long as possible. At first, it seemed like a revolutionary convenience, information available instantly, endless entertainment, connections across continents. But hidden beneath that convenience was a new kind of influence, one that operated quietly through lines of code and invisible systems. A system that didn't just broadcast messages, it learned from every click, every search, every pause of attention. And once that system began guiding what billions of people saw each day, the age of mass media would evolve into something far more complex, the age of the algorithm. And the human mind would soon enter one of the most fascinating and unsettling chapters in the history of influence.
At the dawn of the 21st century, a quiet revolution began unfolding across the world. It didn't arrive with marching armies or dramatic speeches. It appeared through glowing screens, search bars, and social networks. At first, it seemed like the ultimate freedom of information. Anyone could search for answers instantly. Anyone could publish ideas and reach global audiences. News, entertainment, and knowledge were suddenly available at any moment. The internet promised something extraordinary, a world where information was no longer controlled by a few powerful broadcasters. But something unexpected happened as this digital universe expanded. The sheer amount of information became overwhelming. Billions of websites, endless videos, millions of new posts every hour. No human being could possibly navigate it all. And so the internet needed something to organize the chaos. It needed systems capable of deciding what people would see first. Those systems became known as algorithms. An algorithm, in simple terms, is a set of instructions that helps a computer make decisions. At first, these instructions seemed harmless. Search engines used algorithms to rank websites based on relevance. Social media platforms used them to show posts from friends and family. Streaming services used them to recommend movies or songs you might enjoy. The goal was convenience, personalization, efficiency. But as these systems grew more advanced, they began doing something far more powerful than organizing information. They began studying human behavior. Every click, every scroll, every video watched until the end, every post ignored after 2 seconds. All of these tiny actions became data points, signals about curiosity, emotion, attention. Gradually, algorithms learned how to predict what kinds of content would keep each individual user engaged. And once they understood that, they could begin shaping what users saw next. Unlike television, which broadcast the same message to millions of people, algorithm-driven platforms could create unique information environments for every single person. 2 individuals opening the same social media app might see completely different stories, videos, and discussions, each feed carefully assembled based on past behavior. At first glance, this felt empowering. The internet seemed to understand your interests. It delivered content you genuinely wanted to see. But hidden inside this personalization was a subtle transformation. Instead of people exploring the internet began guiding what people explored. And those guiding decisions were made by algorithms designed with one primary goal: keep users engaged as long as possible. To achieve this goal, algorithms learned to prioritize certain types of content. Posts that triggered strong emotional reactions, surprise, excitement, outrage, curiosity, tended to hold attention longer. Videos that created suspense kept viewers watching until the end. Discussions that sparked arguments generated more replies, more activity, more time spent on the platform. Over time, these patterns taught the algorithms something important. Emotion drives engagement, and engagement drives visibility. So the systems naturally began amplifying content most likely to trigger strong emotional responses, not because someone ordered them to, but because that content performed best according to the platform's metrics. And this created a powerful feedback loop. Emotionally charged posts spread further. People reacted strongly. The algorithm noticed the engagement, and then it promoted similar content even more. Gradually, entire information environments began forming around what captured attention most effectively. Another consequence of algorithmic personalization was the emergence of what researchers call information bubbles. Because algorithms learn from past behavior, they tend to show users content similar to what they've already interacted with. If someone frequently watches videos about space exploration, the system recommends more science content. If someone engages with political discussions from a particular viewpoint, similar viewpoints appear more often. At first, this feels convenient. The internet becomes tailored to your interests, but over time, it can create a subtle narrowing of perspective. Different ideas appear less frequently, opposing viewpoints become rarer, and the information environment begins to reflect a version of reality shaped largely by previous preferences. In other words, the system learns to show people what they are most likely to agree with or react to,
which means millions of individuals may end up living in slightly different informational worlds, each one curated by invisible lines of code. But the influence of algorithms extends beyond information. They also shape behavior. Consider the design of many digital platforms. Notifications appear with bright colors, scrolling feeds never truly end, videos automatically play the next recommendation. Each of these design choices interacts with psychological tendencies that keep people engaged. The brain responds strongly to novelty and unpredictability. When users scroll through a feed, they never know exactly what they'll see next. Sometimes it's something fascinating, sometimes something funny, sometimes something shocking. This unpredictable reward pattern is extremely powerful. Psychologists have long known that unpredictable rewards can reinforce behavior more effectively than predictable ones, and digital platforms harness this principle in subtle ways. Every swipe, every refresh, every click becomes part of a continuous search for the next interesting piece of information. The result is a system where attention flows almost effortlessly from one piece of content to the next. Yet the most fascinating aspect of the algorithm era may be how invisible it feels. When people watched television, they knew they were receiving a broadcast from a network. When they saw advertisements, they recognized them as marketing. But algorithms operate quietly in the background. Users rarely see the calculations happening behind their screens. They simply experience the results. A recommended video appears, a trending topic surfaces, a news story shows up in a feed, and it feels natural, almost random. But in reality, that moment may be the result of thousands of tiny computational decisions shaped by data about human attention. And because those decisions happen invisible, many people never think about how strongly their digital environments might be guiding what they see. Of course, algorithms themselves are not conscious manipulators. They don't possess intentions or desires. They simply follow the goals they were designed to pursue. And those goals often revolve around engagement, relevance, and user satisfaction. But when billions of people interact with systems optimized to capture attention, the collective impact becomes enormous. Entire conversations can shift, ideas can spread across continents in hours, movements can rise from viral posts. In some cases, misinformation can spread just as quickly as accurate information, because emotional content travels faster than careful analysis. This is not necessarily the result of malicious design. It is the consequence of powerful technological systems interacting with deeply human psychology. And as these systems grow more advanced, researchers continue asking important questions. How much influence do algorithms truly have of public perception? How can societies balance personalization with exposure to diverse ideas? And how aware are users of the subtle forces shaping their information environments? But even as these questions unfold, influence continues evolving, because beyond algorithms and digital platforms lies an even more refined approach to guiding behavior, one that does not rely on persuasion or emotional storytelling. Instead, it works by gently adjusting the environment in which decisions are made. Tiny changes, barely noticeable, yet powerful enough to influence choices across entire populations. This concept is known as the nudge, and in the next chapter, we will explore how psychologists and policymakers discovered that sometimes the most effective way to guide human behavior is not through arguments or advertisements, but through subtle design.
For centuries, influence had followed a familiar pattern. Someone delivered a message. An audience received it. Persuasion happened through words, images, arguments, or emotion. But by the late 20th century, psychologists began uncovering something surprising. Human decisions are not shaped only by messages. They are also shaped by the environment in which choices are made. Tiny details, often invisible to conscious thought, can dramatically change what people decide to do. This discovery opened the door to a completely different form of influence, one that does not demand attention, one that rarely feels like persuasion. Instead, it quietly rearranges the decision-making landscape, and before people even realize it, their behavior begins to shift. Researchers studying decision-making noticed something curious. When individuals were asked to make choices, the outcome often depended not only on the options themselves, but on how those options were presented. For example, imagine two identical choices. In one scenario, a particular option is listed first. In another, it appears last. Even though nothing about the option itself changes, people are more likely to choose the one placed at the top. Why? Because the human brain tends to rely on shortcuts when processing information. These shortcuts, known as cognitive biases, help us navigate complex decisions quickly, but they also make our choices sensitive to subtle cues. Order, framing, default settings, all of these small design choices can influence decisions without anyone realizing it. And when psychologists understood this, they began asking an intriguing question. What if environments could be designed in ways that gently encourage beneficial behaviors? This idea became known as behavioral design. One of the most famous concepts to emerge from this field is the nudge. A nudge is a small change in how choices are presented, one that guides behavior while still leaving people free to choose differently. Unlike traditional persuasion, a nudge does not rely on arguments or emotional appeals. It simply alters the decision environment. Imagine entering a cafeteria.
Healthy foods are placed at eye level, less nutritious items are positioned further away. Nothing is forbidden, all options remain available, but because people often select what is easiest to reach, many begin choosing the healthier option. That small environmental change nudges behavior in a particular direction. No speech is required, no advertisements necessary, just subtle design. Governments and organizations around the world began experimenting with these ideas. Public policy researchers realized that many social challenges, from saving money to conserving energy, were influenced by everyday decision habits, and sometimes those habits could be shifted through surprisingly simple adjustments. For example, when employees were asked to actively sign up for retirement savings programs, participation rates were relatively low. Many people intended to enroll but kept postponing the decision. But when the system was redesigned so that employees were automatically enrolled by default, participation rates increased dramatically. Individuals still had the option to opt out, yet most people simply stayed enrolled. The change in behavior came not from persuasion, but from the power of a default setting. This revealed something profound about the human mind. Often we follow the path that requires the least effort, and whoever designs that path can influence where it leads. The private sector quickly noticed these discoveries as well. Technology companies, app designers, and product developers began studying how behavioral design could shape user experience. Buttons were placed where the eye naturally looks first. Notifications were designed to feel urgent and rewarding. Apps created frictionless pathways that made certain actions effortless. These design decisions weren't random. They were carefully tested and refined through behavioral research. If one design kept users engaged longer than another, it was adopted. Over time, entire digital environments were built around principles of behavioral psychology. And once those environments reached billions of users, their influence expanded far beyond individual decisions. They began shaping daily habits. Consider something as simple as a notification sound. That small chime triggers curiosity. Who messaged you? What happened? The brain responds instantly. A quick glance at the phone turns into scrolling. Scrolling leads to new content, and before long, minutes or hours have passed. The design did not force anyone to look at their phone, but it nudged them toward it. Multiply that effect across millions of users, thousands of times per day, and the cumulative impact becomes enormous. Behavioral design quietly shapes how people spend their time, where they direct their attention, and what information they encounter. Yet nudges are not always used for commercial purposes. In many cases, they are applied to encourage socially beneficial behavior. Cities have redesigned road markings to encourage safer driving speeds. Energy companies send reports showing how a household's electricity use compares to its neighbors, encouraging conservation. Donation systems highlight how many others have already contributed, increasing participation through social proof. These small adjustments can lead to significant behavioral changes across large populations, and they often achieve results more effectively than traditional campaigns, because they work with human psychology rather than against it. But these discoveries also raise important ethical questions. If subtle design can influence choices so effectively, who decides which direction the nudges should push? Is it acceptable for companies to guide consumer behavior if the goal is increased profit? Should governments use behavioral insights to steer public decisions? Where is the line between helpful guidance and manipulation? These questions remain widely debated among psychologists, policymakers, and ethicists, because influence, once understood, becomes a powerful tool. And like any powerful tool, it can be used for many different purposes. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of nudges is how invisible they often are. People rarely notice when their environment has been structured to guide certain choices. They simply experience the outcome as their own decision, which in many ways it still is. The options remain available. The final choice belongs to the individual, but the path leading to that choice may have been carefully arranged long before the decision was made. And when entire societies operate within environments shaped by behavioral design, influence becomes something almost architectural, built into the systems people interact with every day. Quiet, subtle, persistent. Yet even as behavioral science refined these techniques, another frontier was rapidly approaching. Researchers were beginning to map the brain itself with increasing precision. Neuroscientists were exploring how thoughts form, how emotions emerge, and how decisions are processed inside the complex networks of neurons that define human consciousness. At the same time, artificial intelligence was advancing at breathtaking speed. Algorithms were learning to recognize patterns in human behavior with extraordinary accuracy. Some scientists began asking a question that once belonged only in science fiction. What happens when deep knowledge of the brain merges with powerful computational systems? What if machines could understand not only what people do, but why they do it? The future of influence might not depend solely on propaganda, advertising, media, or behavioral design. It could involve technologies capable of predicting thoughts, emotions, and decisions before they even occur. And if that future arrives, the story of how human minds are influenced may enter its most extraordinary chapter yet, because the ultimate frontier of control has never been territory. It has always been something far more intimate, the human mind itself.
For thousands of years, the methods used to influence human thought have evolved alongside civilization itself. First came myths and rituals, shaping belief in ancient societies. Then propaganda mobilized nations during times of war. Advertising reshaped desire in the consumer age. Mass media influenced how millions perceived reality. Algorithms curated the information people see. Behavioral design gently nudged daily decisions. Each stage brought influence closer to something more precise, more invisible, more deeply connected to the mechanics of the human mind. But now humanity stands at the edge of a new frontier,
one where the understanding of the brain itself may transform influence into something more powerful than ever before, and perhaps more unsettling. Inside research laboratories across the world, neuroscientists are mapping the human brain with astonishing detail. Advanced brain imaging technologies can observe which regions of the brain activate when people experience fear, curiosity, joy, or trust. Scientists can see how the brain reacts to different types of messages, images, and social interactions. They can track how decisions form milliseconds before a person becomes consciously aware of making them. In some experiments, researchers have even been able to predict a person's choice several seconds before that person consciously decides. Not because the machine is controlling the decision, but because the brain's decision-making process begins before conscious awareness catches up. These discoveries reveal something fascinating. What we experience as a sudden decision may actually be the final stage of a complex neurological process already unfolding beneath the surface. The mind, in many ways, is constantly preparing choices before we realize it, and understanding that process opens extraordinary possibilities. At the same time, artificial intelligence is becoming increasingly capable of analyzing human behavior at massive scales. AI systems can study billions of data points, from search patterns and social media activity to language use and emotional responses. They can detect patterns that no human analyst could ever see. These patterns allow systems to predict preferences with remarkable accuracy. What kinds of stories someone might find interesting, what topics might provoke strong reactions, what messages might resonate emotionally. Individually, each prediction may seem minor, but across billions of interactions, these predictions create detailed maps of human attention and behavior, maps that could potentially be used to guide communication with incredible precision. Some researchers believe these technologies could lead to positive breakthroughs. Health campaigns could tailor messages that effectively encourage healthier lifestyles. Educational systems might adapt learning experiences to match how each student's brain processes information. Mental health treatments could use personalized insights to help individuals manage anxiety or depression. Used carefully, knowledge about the brain and behavior could help solve some of society's most difficult challenges. But alongside those possibilities come deeper concerns, because the same tools capable of helping people could also be used to influence them in powerful ways. Imagine a future where systems understand exactly what kind of message will capture your attention, not based on guesswork, but based on detailed behavioral patterns and neurological responses. A message that arrives at the perfect moment, using the exact tone, imagery, and language most likely to resonate with you personally. Individually, it might feel like coincidence, but across millions of people, such targeting could shape public conversations, cultural trends, and even political outcomes. In that world, influence would no longer rely on broadcasting the same message to everyone. It would involve delivering perfectly tailored persuasion to each individual mind. Some experts refer to this possibility as hyper-personalized influence, and while aspects of it already exist in digital advertising and recommendation systems, future technologies could refine the process even further. At the same time, scientists are exploring direct connections between the brain and technology. Brain-computer interfaces, devices capable of translating neural signals into digital commands, are being developed to help people with paralysis control computers or prosthetic limbs. These technologies hold enormous promise for medicine.
They may restore mobility, communication, and independence for individuals facing severe physical challenges. Yet, they also represent a new step in the relationship between technology and the mind. A step where the boundary between human thought and digital systems becomes increasingly interconnected. And whenever new technological capabilities appear, society must decide how they should be used. Because the tools that expand human potential can also reshape the nature of influence itself. Philosophers and scientists often return to a fundamental question when discussing the future of the mind. How much of what we think, believe, and choose is truly independent? Human beings have always been shaped by their environment: family, culture, education, language. Influence has always existed in some form. What is changing today is not the existence of influence, but its precision and scale. The systems surrounding modern life can observe behavior continuously, learn from it, and adapt in real time. They can test millions of variations of messages, designs, and recommendations to see which ones work best. In effect, influence itself is becoming increasingly data-driven, and that means understanding these systems is more important than ever. But there is also an empowering side to the story, because awareness changes everything. Once people recognize the forces that shape their attention, their beliefs, and their decisions, they gain the ability to question them, to pause, to ask where certain ideas originated, to explore different perspectives beyond what algorithms or environments present. The human mind, after all, is not a passive machine. It is capable of reflection, curiosity, critical thought.
These qualities have always allowed individuals to step outside the narrative surrounding them, to challenge assumptions, to reshape their understanding of the world. And perhaps that ability will remain the most powerful safeguard against unseen influence. Because the truth is this: your brain is constantly interacting with a vast network of influences: stories, media, technology, culture, design. Some of those influences help guide society toward progress. Others may steer conversations in directions we barely notice. But the moment you begin asking questions, the moment you start observing how these systems operate, something shifts. Influence becomes visible, patterns begin to emerge, and the mind regains a measure of its independence. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the question is no longer whether influence exists. It always has. The real question is how societies choose to use the powerful tools now emerging from psychology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. Will they help people understand themselves better? Will they guide humanity toward healthier decisions and greater knowledge? Or will they create new forms of invisible pressure shaping what we think and believe? The answer is still being written. By scientists, by policymakers, by designers, and by billions of individuals navigating an increasingly complex information landscape. But perhaps the most important thought to carry forward is this: your mind is one of the most remarkable systems in the known universe, capable of imagination, creativity, and deep reasoning, capable of questioning even the ideas placed inside it. And once you begin noticing the hidden forces that attempt to guide it, you start to see the world differently. Because influence thrives in silence, but awareness changes the game. And the next time a thought appears in your mind, an opinion, a desire, a belief, you might pause for a moment and wonder something fascinating. Where did that thought truly begin? And more importantly, what will you choose to do with it?